So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to you all to our first keynote lecture today. So my name is Reem Saab. I'm an assistant professor in psychology here at AUB, and I am one of the conveners of this conference. I'm so pleased to have the chance to introduce our very distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Hoda al-Sadda. Professor al-Sadda is a professor of English and comparative literature at Cairo University. Her research focuses on gender in Arab cultural history, women's rights, and oral narratives. She is the author of Gender, Nation, and the Arabic Novel. She previously held a chair in the study of the contemporary Arab world at Manchester University and was also the co-director of the Center for the Advanced Study of the Arab World in the UK, in addition to being a Carnegie Visiting Scholar more recently at Georgetown University. Professor al-Sadda sits on the editorial board of various journals, including the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. Importantly, she co-founded in 1995 the now famous Women and Memory Forum, an Egyptian research organization that focuses on the production of knowledge on gender in Arab cultural history, on which she currently serves as chair of the Board of Governance. No introduction of her would be complete without mentioning her outstanding activism for women's rights. Among other things, she was a member of a committee of 50 people that was tasked to draft the Egyptian constitution endorsed in a referendum in 2014, and was a coordinator of the Freedoms and Rights Committee in the Constitutional Assembly. Professor al-Sadda's combination of academia and activism serves as an inspirational role model for what many of us here hope to achieve in our careers. This conference, as you all know, is about what feminism can accomplish in times of crisis, and this is exactly what Professor al-Sadda's talk seeks to address, as she is about to take us on an inspirational journey of what feminists in the Arab world have achieved against all odds under authoritarian post-colonial states. The talk will last 45 minutes, after which we will have a 15-minute Q&A session. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor al-Sadda.
Thank you so much for a very kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here at AUB. It's always wonderful to be in Beirut. So I will try to, so yes, I've titled my talk, it's Against All Odds, Arab Feminisms in Post-Colonial States, a Legacy of Appropriation, Contestation, and Negotiation. For the last few years, since the tumultuous wave of revolutions that shook the Arab world in 2011, and the direct and oftentimes violent confrontations with state structures, I have been very preoccupied with the question of feminists negotiating with power, or how Arab feminists have managed the relation with modern post-colonial nation-states. So while Arab feminists, like all feminists all over the world, have faced patriarchal cultures, but they've also faced challenges related to the burden of colonialism, accusations of westernization, isolation from their cultural heritage, elitism. But in addition, one of the biggest challenges, I would argue, has been the fact that their activism and their entire lives have all been in the context of authoritarian post-colonial states. So if we acknowledge the obvious fact that authoritarianism is not good for anybody, let alone women, that dictatorships by definition are inimical to social movements or collective action or new ideas that can potentially disrupt the hegemonic power structures, we might then see what feminists have accomplished or not in a new light. So to respond to the question, what can feminism achieve in the future, I will construct a narrative of what feminists have achieved against all odds within the constraints of authoritarian post-colonial states that have politically manipulated and appropriated women's rights issues. In other words, I will look at how Arab feminists contested power, negotiated with power, won and lost battles, but have persisted and still do. Now, my talk will attempt a survey of select key trends or key spaces of Arab feminisms with a focus on Egypt. While there are important differences in context and processes between Arab countries, I would still argue that the Egyptian story is an Arab story with important variations, or at least it's a story that resonates with many Arab stories. A couple of words about beginnings. The emergence, which is really important, I think, in this context, because the emergence of the woman question in the Arab world began against the background of colonial domination and the initiation of the modernization project at the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th. Historians of the Arab world have noted how the backward status of Arab women was used by colonialists as a stick to beat Arab societies, and how many early reformers internalized the colonial discourse and put the burden of Arab backwardness on the shoulders of women. Now, the link between women's liberation, national liberation, and the modernization project has always been a double-edged sword. So, bettering the status of women as a condition for modernization was behind Qasim Amin's call for the education of women. So good. At the same time, women in the Arab world were entrusted with the impossible task of being both, and at the same time, icons of tradition and the trailblazers of modernity, or to use Najma Badi's brilliant phrase, to be modern but modest. It also meant that any discussion of women's status in society inevitably became a discussion of something else, of national identity, of national independence, of the relation with the West, of the necessity or lack of safeguarding cultural specificity. So it's never about women's issues as such. Now, needless to say, this symbolic dimension of the woman question complicated women's liberation struggle. What did women do about this ambivalence of the modernist discourse? What were the strategies used? Again, historians have noticed that many embraced the modernist discourse about gender roles and division of labor, or what feminists have labeled domestic ideology. A glance at the magazine El Fatah, the first women's magazine published in 1892, gives a very good overview of how women appropriated yet contested modernist discourses on gender. The magazine propagated the view that women were responsible for their own advancement and that it was conditional on their becoming good managers of their households and their families, and household duties were valorized and put on equal footing with duties of political leaders or managers of companies. So in this sense, embracing domestic ideology became a strategy to ensure worth and status for women. At the same time, the magazine presented its readers with news and biographies of prominent women who have distinguished themselves in the public sphere, hence supporting their aspiration to acquire more roles outside their homes. It's also important to note that this modernist discourse did not go unchallenged, and I just mentioned briefly, Malak Hifni Nasif was one of the voices that critiqued these modernist discourses on gender of the Nahda reformers. She refuted Amin's call for the unveiling of women as a condition for their emancipation and argued instead for prioritizing access to education so that women can make informed choices as regards their lives and bodies. Second space, women and national independence. Feminist movements in the Arab world were always integral partners in the national independence movements and the struggle against colonialism. This is acknowledged as a key feature of Arab women's movements and one that is persistently highlighted in mainstream literature as to why some women's movements gained legitimacy. In Egypt, for example, women participated in the 1919 revolution, against British colonialism. We celebrate the 16th of March as the Egyptian Women's Day, which marks the date of women martyrs shot by British soldiers during demonstrations in 1919. Now, it's certainly true that women's participation in the 1919 revolution accorded value and legitimacy to the nascent women's movement in Egypt. Empowered by their participation in the 1919 revolution, the Women Committee, for example, was formed in the Weft Party. The period from 1920s to the early 50s is generally acknowledged as particularly vibrant in the history of the women's movement in Egypt. The Egyptian Feminist Union was founded in 1923. The political context here is relevant. This union mainly consisted of members of the Women's Committee in the Weft, who decided to establish an all-women organization and depart from the Weft Party consequent to the party's disregard of their opinions and demands of the Women's Committee. Now, this union played an important role in raising awareness, lobbying for advancement of women's rights agendas, mobilizing resources and public opinion to advocate for national independence, and members of the union assumed radical positions on national independence, democracy, and Arab solidarity. Examples of women's participation in national liberation movements abound in all Arab countries. Furthermore, Arab women's rights activists agreed to give precedence to national independence over their demands for rights. The classic example we always give in this regard is Algeria in 1958, and as a reaction to a call by French colonialists to Algerian women, asking them to burn their veils in a public square and chant "Algeria is French," Algerian women wore veils as a symbolic confirmation of their national identity and immersed themselves in the struggle for independence and postponed their struggle for gender rights. The downside of the story, of course, is that women's participation in national independence movements did not always translate, in fact, most of the time, did not translate into an acknowledgement of their demands after independence in the post-colonial nation states. In fact, and with reference again to the Algerian case, despite women's huge sacrifices in the war of liberation, they were asked by their comrades to return to their homes. So bearing in mind significant variations between Arab countries, women were not recognized as equal partners in the process of constructing modern nation states many, many times. Third space, state feminism in post-colonial states. State feminism in the Arab world usually has negative connotations and is generally seen as one of the obstacles that have impeded the formation of strong feminist movements. It's important, therefore, I think, to begin by pointing out that the term state feminism, as applied to Scandinavian countries, for example, denotes a reformist agenda adopted by the state to rectify gender inequality in state structures and mechanisms by enacting gender-sensitive laws and increasing the number of women in public office. It's regarded by many in a positive light, despite recent criticisms by feminists. Historically, state feminism in the Arab world is a phenomenon of the 50s and the 60s, i.e. the beginnings of independent post-colonial states. However, state feminism in the Arab world brings to mind words like co-optation, appropriation, and manipulation. Why? In an article on state feminism in Egypt, Mirvat Hatem describes the role of state feminism in the 50s and 60s as paradoxical. On the one hand, much was achieved. The 1956 Constitution guaranteed equality before the law, no discrimination based on gender, race, language, religion, or belief, and granted women political rights. Labor laws were modified to enable working women to perform their reproductive roles. On the other hand, personal status laws were left untouched, meaning that patriarchal domination of women in the private sphere was left unchallenged. Tunisia, of course, is always the exception here. This created a bizarre situation where women attained equality in the public sphere, but were subject to the authority of male members of their families in the private sphere. Now, the second important problematic feature of state feminism in the Arab world is that at the same time as the state was passing laws in favor of women, the post-colonial state deliberately and effectively demobilized movements in general. In Egypt, demobilized Egyptian feminist organizations, according to Hatem. Post-colonial Arab states, with variations but without exception, developed into authoritarian post-colonial states which clamped down on dissent and all forms of opposition movements and instituted one-party systems and nationalized social movements. The classic example, Egyptian example, of the tension between feminist organizations and the post-colonial state is the story of the Egyptian Feminist Union founded by Hoda in 1923. So this was an independent feminist organization which advocated for a political and social agenda. In 1956, the union was dissolved by orders of the Revolutionary Council leadership and replaced by the Association of Hoda Sha'arawi, which became a charity organization which provided social services. It was no longer allowed to pursue a political agenda or to practice activities with a political nature. This new state of affairs resulted in the expulsion of many feminists from public life. Some were able to withdraw quietly and refocus their attention on apolitical public service. Others paid high prices for their independence. For example, Dureya Shafiq paid a heavy price for publicly objecting to the dictatorial nature of the new political order. In 1957, she went on a hunger strike at the Indian embassy in Cairo to protest against what she described as the dictatorial direction of the Nasser regime. She was banned from public life and put under house arrest, and her life ended tragically with suicide. So 2 things to remember. Many in fact, three things to remember. Many feminists seized the opportunities that were opening up for women to rise and pursue successful careers that at a later stage, when the political sphere opened up slightly, were able to return to public life, armed with expertise and authority they have gained over the years. Second, other feminists were able to work within state structures and accommodate to the political restrictions and achieved a few things. And then third, all the achievements of state feminism are actually based on the work of independent feminists, on their demands, on their programs, and their ideas. In the 1990s, and until the first decade of the 21st century, state feminism went through a new phase, a sort of mutation manifested in the establishment of national councils for women headed by first ladies most of the time. These new structures came in response to new international developments regarding the role of governments in supporting women's rights agendas, as well as local developments in policy and political ideology. I will interrupt my analysis of these new mutations of state feminism by examining first the conditions that led to their formation. Okay, I lost one of my pages. Sorry about just a minute. Wow, yes, all good. So the internationalization of women's rights. So this is the new space that I would like to talk about first and then go back to state feminism. The historical roots of the internationalization of women's rights extends back to 1975, when the General Assembly of the UN declared 1975 as the International Women's Year, and held the first World Conference of Women in Mexico City the same year, and announced the years 1976-1985 as the new UN Decade for Women, dedicating a voluntary fund to support this declaration. In 1979, the General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW. The Second World Conference on Women, held in Nairobi in 1985, was described by many as the birth of global feminism, as it situated women's rights agendas at the center of world politics. The Beijing Platform for Action, adopted in 1995 at the Fourth World Conference on Women, declared women's rights as human rights, and more importantly, committed states to specific actions to guarantee their compliance with the agreed resolutions. Now, one of the strategic objectives in the Beijing Platform for Action committed governments to create national machinery where it does not exist, and strengthen as appropriate existing national machineries for the advancement of women at the highest possible level of government. It should have clearly defined, these machineries should have clearly defined mandates and authority. Critical elements would be adequate resources and the ability and competence to influence policy and formulate and review legislation, among other things. It should perform policy analysis, undertake advocacy, communication, coordination, and monitoring of implementation. All of this comes from the resolution, and these were all commitments to governments. The formation of national councils of women or other forms of national machineries to promote women's rights in the Arab world happened against the background of these global trends in international politics. There's a vast amount of scholarship assessing the impact of the role of the UN and the internationalization of women's rights on women's movements all over the world. Elizabeth Friedman, for example, however, and this is, I want to put it here first, between the term internationalism and transnationalism. According to her, internationalism particularly addresses the interaction between states, often to the exclusion of non-state actors. This is internationalism. Transnationalism, on the other hand, is used to characterize regular activity crossing national borders that involves non-state actors. So the point here is the extent to which making women's rights issues an important component in international politics or interstate relations. To what extent this development was good for women's movements remains a matter of contention, of course. Now, Sylvia Walby has argued that the integration of feminism in the international discourse of human rights, with the emphasis on the responsibilities of states to protect those rights as a prerequisite for inclusion in the international regime of civilized states, has led to positive measures undertaken by states in support of women's rights agendas. She foregrounds how feminists worldwide use this development to lobby their governments. And she says that in this international regime, I'm quoting, the nation state has been the subject of a successful pincer movement by feminists organized at both grassroots and transnational levels. Feminist researchers have also shed light on how participation in these high-profile UN conferences has helped them legitimize their demands and mobilize resources and strengthen local women's movements. On the other hand, feminists have also noted that the effect of the internationalization of women's rights has not always had a positive impact and have highlighted many negative consequences in certain cases, namely the manipulation of international mechanisms by political leaders with detrimental effects on women's movements, the adoption of foreign agendas that do not necessarily reflect national priorities, and the unequal distribution of resources and social capital. A contentious issue, for sure. But how does all this play out in the Arab world? It's noteworthy that Egypt and Tunisia were amongst the countries that proposed that the UN dedicate a year to the discussion of women's rights agendas in the international arena. The opportunity was seized by women's rights activists who participated in international conferences, joined international networks, and consolidated transnational alliances. International forums and meetings also became platforms for lobbying governments in the Arab world. So, in a very specific case, examining, Mona Al-Ghubashi has a very interesting contribution in this regard. She looks at processes of political change in Egypt, and she has argued that the internationalization of the political regime in Egypt since the mid-1990s was a key factor that afforded activists and ordinary citizens unexpected political leverage in their asymmetric share of public power with the executive, end of quote. Al-Ghubashi points out that despite the absence of democratic governance, the Egyptian state was a signatory to human rights conventions and bilateral treaties, which imposed international legal commitments, and that integration in the international standard-setting regime created a space for rights activists to use the concept of the rule of law to contest state violations of rights. In addition to the commitments to international conventions, Egypt, again, as a good example of an Arab post-colonial state, was invested in being recognized as an important player on the international scene as a modern nation worthy of a seat in the global club of civilized countries. One of the persistent tropes in mainstream media in Egypt, most of you would know, has been the necessity of safeguarding the image of Egypt. It's a narrative about an imagined civilized and modern state as well as an important player in international politics. Hence, the internationalization of Egyptian politics plus the projected self-image of a modern state afforded rights activists disproportionate powers vis-à-vis state representatives in international forums as they invoke the standards of the rule of law to challenge violations and argue for rights. I have argued elsewhere that this imagined role of Egypt as a key player in international politics and membership in the International Club of Civilized Nations was a key factor in the negotiations over Article 11, or the women's article in the Egyptian constitution endorsed in 2014, acknowledged by many feminists as a positive step forward in enabling a women's rights agenda. So there are important stories yet to be told and documented about how feminists have made use of international forums to further their agendas in local settings. One of these stories took place in 1985, and I'd like to just mention it briefly. It was right before the Nairobi conference. In May 1985, the Supreme Constitutional Court in Egypt ruled that Law 44/1979 was unconstitutional on procedural grounds. The said law, known in Egypt as Jihan law, Jihan being the wife of President Sadda, had introduced some very basic amendments to the personal status laws that regulated polygamy, facilitated women obtaining divorce subsequent to a husband taking another wife, and so on. Now, the law was actually passed unconstitutionally. It was unconstitutional. It was passed by presidential decree during the period of recess of parliament and was not subsequently presented to parliament for endorsement as per constitutional mandate. It was also not of an urgent matter, so that it was actually unconstitutional. it was directly linked to the president's wife influence and a manifestation of a state feminism that had become extremely unpopular and vulnerable to opposition. However, the substance of the law was amongst the demands of women's rights activists and addressed very real and practical legal issues that had an adverse impact on women's daily lives. Now, women's rights activists in Egypt saw the annulment of the law as a setback to women's rights. And once the word was out about the possibility of annulment, women's rights activists formed the Committee for the Protection of the Family and Women, lobbied Parliament, and they tried to reverse the annulment and endorse a new law. The committee, the details of the meetings of this committee are actually very interesting. I mean, they met in the association of Hoda Sha'arawi. They published announcements in newspapers. They tried to really to lobby and to bring in many voices in this activism. The efforts of this committee were relatively successful. Law 100 of 1985 was passed with very similar articles to Law 44 that was annulled, but with a compromise to appease the conservatives. Never mind the compromise. However, the point I'm trying to make is that the main reason that speeded up the process of the annulled law going back to Parliament and passed in record time, really, was the Women's Conference in Nairobi in 1985. Because the annulment would have been a sign of a lack of commitment on the part of the state to furthering women's rights agendas and a possible embarrassment on the international stage. So this was used against the Egyptian government, and it's an example of a success story to an extent. So going back to the National Council of Women in Arab States, they soon became the 21st century mutation of state feminism. In theory, or as per UN directives, states are required to ensure the autonomy of these machineries by providing the necessary resources and legal structures. In practice, in authoritarian post-colonial states, these bodies gradually became arms of state manipulation over women's rights issues. Most of these councils were headed by first ladies, were intolerant of dissenting voices, and were exclusionary, not inclusionary. In Egypt, it gradually became clear that the primary goal of the council was to nationalize women's rights agendas, making it the prerogative of council members to act as the sole representatives of women's rights issues in local and international forums. So how did feminists interact with National Council for Women in Egypt in particular? Again, we find ourselves in a very varied and complex scene. Bearing in mind the already existing diversity in ideological and political positions amongst feminists, we can discern a wide spectrum of positions and interactions, ranging from a radical standpoint that rejected cooperation under any circumstance, to the other end of the spectrum of accommodation to the reality on the ground. But between these two positions, I choose to characterize the primary form of interaction as one based on an assessment of the political context at any given moment and an appraisal of potential losses and gains, and the decision to cooperate on issue-based campaigns or projects. Again, this is a story that needs to be documented and written. In the years since 2011, the revolution, the National Council for Women became a site of contestation, not just between feminists and the state, but also between state institutions, due to interstate divisions and power struggles, notably with the rise of Islamist parties and their entrance into formal politics. Again, this is a story that remains to be written, really, but I will mention just some features very briefly for the purpose of shedding light on how feminists interact with the state in this regard. In March 2011, feminist organizations came together and formed the Coalition of Egyptian Feminist Organizations. One of the tasks undertaken by the coalition was the reformation and restructuring of the National Council, with the view of making it more autonomous, meaning independent of state control, and more in harmony with independent feminist organizations, and also more effective in pursuing and implementing gender-sensitive policies in state institutions. So meetings were held with state actors then in power. A proposal, in fact, was submitted officially to the cabinet. There was a moment, completely gone, when meetings with the cabinet to lobby for the reformation of the National Council for Women was possible, when the political sphere was open and accommodated dissenting voices and enabled them to voice their views in the media to wider audiences. However, the efforts to reform were stalled and did not materialize. In the second half of 2012, the National Council for Women became a target of attack by the new Islamist political elite, and efforts were made to take over the institution with the view of Islamizing it. A struggle ensued between the council members and Islamist state actors. In October 2012, for example, the National Council issued a statement rejecting the 2012 draft constitution written by a constituent assembly with an Islamist majority. This statement is one of the statements that was completely in coordination with. Now, under normal circumstances, I'll just pick up from where I left. Under normal circumstances, this dissent of the National Council for Women would have been unthinkable. And it must be understood as a concrete example of divisions and conflicts between state institutions, of course. At the same time, this position was in harmony with the position of feminist organizations and the non-Islamist political parties and movements in the country. So I'm just saying that sometimes, there is some sort of harmony. But events, as we all know, took an unfortunate turn on all fronts. We're back to the tension between independent women's organizations and the National Council as regards its new old role of becoming the sole representative of women's issues locally and internationally, and of course, an attempt to nationalize the women's movement. I think a word is in order here about transnational Arab feminism, since I've talked about internationalization of women's rights. Now, I would like to pick up here on the distinction made above between internationalism and transnationalism, where transnationalism characterizes non-state actors, women rights groups, independent feminists working together across borders. Long before the UN and the internationalization of rights talk, Arab women forged alliances with feminists and feminist organizations all over the world. I think this is a really important point to stress, and there are so many examples. Much has been written, for example, about Hoda Sha'rawi's participation in the 9th Congress of the London-based International Women's Suffrage Alliance, held in Rome in 1923. But also important to remember that Sha'rawi traveled wide and far, sent delegates from the Union to meetings and conferences all over the world to make the case for the independence of Egypt, confront Zionist claims to Palestine, and establish links with feminists across the world, many links, many stories about India in particular. A trip to Berlin introduced Sha'rawi to Sarojini Naidu, an Indian feminist who became, after independence, governor of the Uttar Pradesh. The two women exchanged experiences, learned from each other. Transnational solidarity between feminists, sharing experiences, strategizing together has been and continues to be a very important aspect of Arab feminisms. These transnational encounters have not been without challenges and problems due to unequal power relations, colonial legacies, regional and international disputes and rivalries. Nonetheless, it's possible to say that there are now in existence strong feminist networks and alliances that have succeeded in addressing and managing some of these challenges. Transnational feminism has also benefited from the internationalization of women's rights, making use of the platforms and opportunities for interaction and exchange. The following space, I would like to talk about Arab feminists and Islam. The movement of Islamic feminism is generally acknowledged to have emerged in the 1980s, gaining prominence in the 90s. However, if we think of Islamic feminism as a form of women's engagement with Islamic heritage, production of knowledge, that empower women arguing for rights from within an Islamic framework, i.e. one of the approaches undertaken by women to advocate for their rights, then we need to go back a bit further. In fact, we can go back to mid-19th century, Aisha Taimuriya, and then to Malak Hifni Nasif, Nazira Zainuddin. These are all women who engaged with Islamic texts and dictums regarding women with the view of challenging patriarchal interpretations that undermined women and consolidated male power. Even women who are perceived as representing the secular feminist movement, such as Hoda Sha'rawi, argued for women's rights from within an Islamic frame of reference. Also to remember that in Tunisia, the reform of the Code of Personal Status was conducted with recourse to the premise that Islamic texts allow for multiple interpretations and are adaptable to changing historical conditions. In other words, the entire reform project was phrased and conceptualized from within an Islamic frame of reference. The same can be said regarding the reforms of the Mudawwana in Morocco in 2004. Islamic feminism is and continues to be a highly contested label, as many of its key advocates and practitioners distance themselves from the label or problematize it or qualify it. It has changed its meaning over the years and has many definitions and manifestations, almost as many as the women who engage with it. In her earlier work, Ziba Mir Hosseini links the beginnings of the Islamic feminist movement with the establishment of the Islamic Republic in Iran in 1979. And she used the term Islamic feminist to describe Islamist Iranian women who, after the 1979 revolution, played a crucial role in silencing other women's voices. So this is a very, very specific definition. So in fact, what she did here was that she identified Islamic feminists as supporters of Islamist agendas. But she later changes her mind. She later makes a distinction, and this is the one that's more used now. She makes a distinction between Islamic feminists and Islamist women. And she argues that Islamic feminists do not necessarily subscribe to political Islam, and more importantly, engage critically with Islamic texts and Islamist movements, culminating in the Musawa movement, in which Hosseini herself is a key participant. So she has changed radically, in fact. Umayma Abu Bakr, a prominent Egyptian Islamic feminist, defines the Islamic feminist movement as an intellectual and activist project that focuses on the production of gender-sensitive knowledge within an Islamic frame of reference. I'm quoting. She adds, besides critiquing patriarchal discrimination, the ultimate in male mainstream jurisprudence, the ultimate aim is reform and reconstruction. It is this Islamic feminist knowledge production project that is now recognized as characteristic of the movement. In the 1980s, women's groups in Egypt were self-identified as secular. A more accurate term, I suggest, would be non-Islamist due to the many meanings and connotations of secular in the Egyptian context, and of course, Nadia Al-Ali has an important intervention in the use of the term secular and connotations of the term in Egypt. In 1993, in preparation for the ICPD, the International Conference for Population and Development, the issue of how to frame women's rights agenda, that is using a universal rights approach versus a rights approach compatible with Islam, was the subject of heated discussions amongst feminists. But the consensus at the end was in favor of arguing for rights from within an Islamic cultural framework. This was particularly the case with the task force that worked on proposing amendments to marriage and divorce laws in Egypt, a campaign that eventually led to passing Law 1 in 2000, which made it possible for women to obtain a no-fault divorce and a number of other things. Now, the ICPD, which convened in Egypt, I would argue, was an important milestone in the history of the women's movement in Egypt. It enabled public debates on gender rights, pushed rights agendas, and encouraged the formation of feminist groups. But I will also argue that the overall experience, particularly the direct and confrontational encounters with Islamists in the NGO forum, convinced many groups to rethink their positions vis-à-vis ignoring or disregarding the culturalist Islamist discourses in their activism. Hence, framing women's rights agendas with reference to values and concepts in Islam has been a key strategy undertaken by women's rights activists in their battle for rights. The picture, I would argue, has been blurred or distorted due to the large variations in the usage and meanings and connotations of the terms feminism, Islam, religion, and the conflicting, even adversarial ideological positions pitting secular feminism against Islamic feminism. I refer again to the article written by Ziba Mir Hosseini in 2011, where she notes the rancor and anger often exhibited by radical voices from both camps, vis-à-vis one another, despite the fluidity and the transformations in the positions of many feminists in response to historical changes. Hosseini, as a feminist, whose views regarding the relation or tension between feminism and religion have developed and changed along the years, and she ends her article calling for a reconciliation and transcendence of the distinction between secular feminism and Islamic feminism. A question arises. Since one of the arguments for the importance of Islamic feminism in Arab societies has been that the references to Islamic values and concepts enable them to address larger audiences in their societies and legitimizes their work by virtue of its closeness to Arab cultures and values, how effective have this approach been? So, what have they done? It's a difficult question to answer, particularly as I've spent time blurring the boundaries between Islamic feminists and secular feminists. It is certainly true that in certain contexts, resorting to religious justifications has often been very useful, and that this strategy has been adopted by feminists of all stripes, in fact. However, two things to note. When an Islamic feminist in Egypt, for example, challenges the core of patriarchal discrimination with solid scholarship, she will be met with maximum aggression and actually may be dismissed or denied access to public platforms. So it's not like Islamic feminists have an easy ride. As we have all learned, producing feminist theological knowledge is one thing, but having the authority and the power to disseminate this knowledge and be heard and accepted by the mainstream is another. Islamic feminists, therefore, are not necessarily looked upon favorably by orthodox and conservative religious establishments. On the contrary, they're regarded with suspicion by authoritarian post-colonial states who have consistently sought to manipulate the power of religion to their own ends. They don't want people subverting the status quo. So it all boils down, so I mean, we come back to the issue of power. Like secular feminists, Islamic feminists are also entangled in this complex relation between state, religion, and dictatorship. Okay, so some reflections in the conclusion. I have attempted a very quick survey of how feminists in Egypt in particular have made use of opportunities presented to them, how they negotiated, accommodated, or confronted power, taking into consideration multiple key trends in the history of Arab feminisms. My aim has been threefold: to highlight the variety and richness in direction and activism, to invite a revision of some dominant stereotypical narratives about feminist activism that undermine much that was achieved, and to shed light on an important variable that often gets lost in accounts, that Arab feminists practiced and advocated for their rights in authoritarian contexts that are not, by definition, genuine supporters of rights and freedoms. In other words, Arab feminists, in their struggle for gender justice, did not only confront patriarchal prejudice and discrimination, but they did so in undemocratic authoritarian settings that are inimical to all forms of collective organizing and collective action. In the aftermath of the wave of Arab revolutions in 2011, feminists in Egypt seized the opportunities that were presented to them consequent to the opening up of political spaces for mobilization and activism on the ground. They formed a feminist coalition, partnered with broader coalitions, joined new political parties and various initiatives, organized campaigns, organized and participated in street demonstrations, participated in negotiations with official bodies and state actors over legal reform, constitutional reform, lobbied members of parliament, led media campaigns to raise consciousness, and so on. Now, with the vilification campaign against rights groups and the closing down of political spaces that marks the current moment in Egypt, it's easy and very common to hear voices that question the ability of feminists to attain the goal of gender justice. But despite the fact that right now, the light at the end of the tunnel is difficult to see, it is important to remember that gains have been achieved. There is consensus amongst feminists in Egypt, for example, that one of the gains of the revolutionary interlude has been the breaking of the taboo about sexual violence, for example. A law was passed criminalizing harassment, anti-sexual harassment units have been established in police stations, and the issue is no longer treated as a taboo, but as a social challenge that must be addressed. Tunisia, of course, the jewel of the crown in Arab revolutions, passed one of the most progressive anti-violence against women laws in the world. The history of Arab feminisms is a history of appropriation, manipulation, and negotiation with power in authoritarian post-colonial states. Arab feminisms, I would argue, are not in crisis, but are constantly operating in crisis mode, I would say, which is the modus operandi of feminists living under dictatorships. We have accumulated a lot of experience and skills in confronting challenges, accommodating setbacks, and surviving against all odds. To answer the question, what can feminism accomplish, we must first acknowledge and recognize what feminism has accomplished and under what circumstances. Understanding the past is a prerequisite for charting the future. And our past, understandably, is strewn with numerous losses and gains, achievements and setbacks, successes and frustration. There is significant scholarship that documents women's movements in the Arab world, yet much remains unsaid and unwritten. These are the little fragments, the differentiated stories of state and non-state actors in local, regional, and international settings. Who said what and why and where? Why was one meeting successful? Why another meeting failed? What made an international solidarity campaign successful while another one failed? I would make a case for the necessity of remembering and preserving our memory, both short-term and long-term. So all things considered, and to end on a positive note, much has been achieved, and much more will be achieved. Thank you. Do we need I think we can take, shall we take? Okay, and then I'll answer this. Yes, okay, sure.
So time for questions.
Okay, Nadia?
My name is Nadia Ali. Thank you, Hoda. So I was wondering if you can share with us your reflections on the state. And clearly our problem has been the authoritarian state, but I wonder whether it is not merely the authoritarian state, but authoritarianism, because I feel that even if there is no state or a failed state or a fragmented state, it seems that authoritarianism cuts across different levels. So if you can speak a little bit about that. Then I was wondering, I mean, you are, I think, very eloquently point to the continuum of different positions vis-a-vis our involvement with the state. Now I was wondering if you could share, based on your own experiences, what would you say are the red lines in terms of when does something is worth it or productive, despite the compromises we make and the fallouts, and when is something really a matter of us then becoming, part of a tokenistic gesture or cooptation, or even us actually, in some ways, giving justification or crediting, not just authoritarian, but criminal acts. So what are your red lines? And sort of based on your experience, what do you think were instances where it worked and where maybe, in hindsight, you wouldn't have wanted to be involved?
Take 3 questions.
I just want to thank you, Hoda, for your Dr. Professor Sadda, for your speech. And I think what is important here is to build stock on the different experiences, the different national experience, on the different national experiences that we are going through. Up till now, we had a very post-independent narrative about women emancipation. What I hear from you is a democratic narrative, rewriting history with some anachronism, of course. Who would say that Abdel Nasser was dictatorial except Doria Shafiq? And this is why she was so representative of a minority. But I think that national experiences are very different, and the Palestinian case and the Egyptian case has nothing in common. And NGOization is not as explanatory as it tends to be. And I think that if we start to take these differences under the microscope and discuss it, it would be much more interesting than building silos that don't talk to each other. Thank you.
It's a continuation of Dina's question. Because you showed there's so many facets of engagement between women and women's organizations and the state, you know, and you showed, of course, the co-opted, you know, form of women's activism from within the state, and also the contestation coming from outside the state. My question is related to the point raised by Dina, in the sense that would you agree that to come together and form a powerful position vis-a-vis state policies and the co-optation of women's rights and issues in general was difficult because women are coming from different organizations. Related to that is the ease with which, you know, the state managed to put an end, a quick end, administrative, you know, end to this form of diversified activities because their form of organization. Thank you.
Okay, up to you. I mean, but there's a question here. Maybe she wants. Yeah.
One more, and then
Okay,
we have.
yeah.
Thank you, Professor Sadda, for your speech. I have a question regarding women machineries. In non-democratic systems, are they set out for failure? Are they by design not feminist? And in the event where they have been able to collaborate with feminist agendas, what were those requirements? Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay. Right. So thank you for all the questions. They're all very important. Some of them need some thinking. So, Nandia, so authority. Yes, I mean, right. I like to. I wanted to stress this authoritarian aspect of the post-colonial states, to be honest. But you're right. It's authoritarianism, but because sometimes I guess one of the reasons I'm doing that is because we tend to judge ourselves sometimes as if we're operating in democratic settings, and so the same criteria apply, and I don't think that's fair. So maybe this is the reason I've kind of focused on that. The red lines, very difficult, very contextual. I mean, there is so, but I will share with you an experience which is personal, no problem. So, for example, when I was invited to be a member of the Constitutional Drafting Committee, so my friends were divided. Some of them said, yes, go ahead, this is fantastic. But then there was a group of feminists, very close friends of mine, who thought we do not get involved in these things. Yeah. So you understand, it was very contested. My experience, so I went, but so I have a reformist gene in me. I kind of go for reform all the time. But the point is, so after the experience, I am delighted that I decided to participate. And I'll tell you why. So even though a lot of us are now extremely skeptical about the status of the Constitution and what happened and so on, but we need to remember that all the court cases that are currently being looked at in front of, not all, but a lot of the court cases that are being looked at and in Egyptian courts actually depend on the Constitution. I mean, so there is some, even in situations where you would think that maybe it wasn't a useful exercise, but actually it was at some level. So if you think of a couple of really important cases that, against the demonstration law, for example, it was all based on the constitutional text, and that allowed the Supreme Court to rule that it was unconstitutional. So all things considered, sometimes red lines what I'm trying to say is that the red lines can change even your perception of these red lines can actually change with the changing times. So to answer the question, it's very difficult to decide really when the red line, I mean, it's really about, and what I try and do here is I look at the situation or I try to be, to have the larger, if you like, an overview. Sometimes you make wrong decisions, of course, but sometimes, you know, with some luck, you make the right decisions. But it's very difficult to decide on red lines because it's very contextual. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to give you an honest answer here, so there is no answer, I guess. Dina, Democrat? Yes, it's a Democrat. I am. Let me just say that we need to differentiate national. Absolutely. I mean, I'm not. I tried to. This is an Egyptian story. Very, very different experiences, but there are important similarities, I would still argue, which is why I always talk about the Egyptian story as an Arab story, but this is not to say that it's the only experience. Obviously, the story of Palestine is very different from Egypt, from Tunis, and so on, so we do have to differentiate and to have some serious comparisons, but that was not what I was trying to do here. Islah, was the state able to, I mean, well, yes, certain forms of organization enable the state to take certain measures to demobilize. But if you look at history, states are. I mean, we have powerful states, and you will always find states trying to. I mean, let's go back to the Awqaf, for example. So, you know, the Awqaf was this form of civil society being sort of independent from the state, but then they were nationalized at one point, and this kind of, if you like, pulled that carpet from underneath civil society in many ways because it deprived them of important sources of funding, right? So states will always, so it's really a constant power struggle, I would say, and states find different ways for manipulating, you know, independent civil society organizations, but I don't think we should, if you like, blame ourselves for taking an opportunity that presented itself at one historical moment, and it was a good opportunity at the time, and some good came out of it. Now, the fact that this was turned around is really another time and another context. I mean, the easy example here is social media. If you think of the role of social media during revolutions, it was really important. Now, social media is being used against revolutions now. Does that mean that social media is necessarily bad and we should not have used it? I don't think so. So I think we need to look at things in context, and really, there are so many changes, and we just have to rethink and regroup and accommodate, I guess. So. Are national councils always set out for failure? I don't think so. I don't think so. Again, I mean, this is where differentiated stories are very important because it's difficult to generalize. What I've tried to do here is to sort of just point out an important moment when actually the National Council was in complete harmony with independent state organizations, so it can happen. But also, I don't dismiss state feminism out of hand, because it's important, right? So at the end of the day, there's an argument for these national councils, because at the end of the day, okay, so we do have these difficult relationships with them, but they are capable of doing things and at the level of state institutions that we have not been able to do because of our undemocratic settings. So I wouldn't completely say that they were completely useless. No, I wouldn't say that. Okay. Go ahead. Okay. Yeah.
So thank you. My question is related to personal status laws, which, when we talk about the state and feminist movements, is one of the areas the state has continued to hold control. The personal status law in Egypt of 1920 and then the subsequent amendments essentially lasted until 1979. And one of the questions that's been repeatedly raised is why this particular law lasted for so long, and why women And you talked about we tend to pretend that we are in a democratic setting. But why women accepted that this law continued to last for so long? I think it was Mona Zulfikar who had kind of said that the women accepted that this was a state prerogative in the private sphere, and law worked instead on the public sphere and getting women in government institutions, etc., and kind of relegated the private sphere, accepted that this was an area of state control. I'm not sure if that's right or wrong, and so I pose this question to you. Why do you think this was, in particular, the personal status law, and as it pertains to family and the role of women in the family, why did it last so long?
Hi, thank you very much for a brilliant lecture. I wanted to, I really enjoyed how you've done this in the sense that you've showed how feminism has always also been interested in larger political issues of nation or society, let's say society, starting from modernity or the modernization of Arab society, and then moving on to decolonial movements and then post-colonial optimism. This kind of builds a bit on the question just before me, especially on, oh, I forgot now the word. I forget my words. But anyway, what I wanted to ask is, when you're doing this trajectory, when you're doing this genealogy, and you arrive at the NGOs, I wonder about. I mean, why are you? What is the use of having the state feminism so endorsed as a feminist movement, in the sense that since it was already co-opted by the first ladies, it remains symbolically, it puts the women at immediately, the assumption is that they are secondary to men. They will never be the presidents, they'll always be the first ladies. And the NGOs, in a sense, allowed feminists to move away from the state and, in fact, join other movements of liberation that are not just about identities. I mean, no? In a sense, authoritarianism in the Arab world is extremely patriarchal, unlike, say, maybe China, where they don't inherit power. Here you have an extremely patriarchal state that feminism has a lot to offer besides just the private sphere, whereas the state feminism is almost exclusively private. No?
It's exclusively private?
It focuses on private issues, so violence against women in the bedroom, or it's about, that's how I understand it. I don't know, maybe you can correct me and give us examples of the opening up of the public sphere in ways that put women on equality at par with men.
Okay. Okay. So the organizers think that we should not have more questions. We need to fit. Okay. I'm sorry about that. So very briefly, so I'm not sure about women deciding not to touch, because but there are many examples of attempts to change personal status laws. The problem in Egypt, of course, is that somehow personal status laws became like almost sacred. So they had this sacred aspect or characterization, and anyone who comes close to suggesting that we need to change personal status laws, they're immediately attacked by religious leaders and Azhar and so on. So, but if you look at the history of women, but there have been many attempts. This has always been, in fact, for a lot of people, activism in Egypt is all about personal status laws. So it is not the case that it was left untouched. It was just the case that this was the situation. This is the period of state feminism. There were no independent voices at the time, really, in organized form, but lots of proposals, lots of very interesting things to look at here. So I wouldn't say it was left at all. State feminism. So if I understand you correctly, no, state feminism. We're using it to. Basically, it's the okay, in the case of the Arab world, basically these are the feminists, or if you like, women rights activists who are working within state structures, if you like, and who've been able to pass some interesting laws. Now, I'm not sure about, one of the things we have to accept is that, again, in these undemocratic settings, with parliaments that do not really listen to lobbies or, social movements. I mean, so the fact is, for example, that the law that was passed in 2000 in Egypt, which was a good law, whatever, was passed. Okay, so all the work has been done by the feminists. All the work is really, I mean, we have to give credit to the women's movement, but it went through parliament because the First Lady told them so. It's a fact of life. Now, the question is, do we say we do not want this law because it was passed in a dictatorial fashion? It's a question, really. So it's a question I think that we have to talk about. So in that case, it was useful, right? And I always liked, okay, let me just end by saying, I look at the feminist movement here when I'm involved in it. There is a distinction between sort of what I would like to do, but there's always, I think of it as a political movement. And in politics, it's the art of the possible sometimes. I'm sorry if I'm saying things that might upset a few people here, but it is the art of the possible. Context is very important. And yes, people do make decisions based on what is possible and allowed at a certain point in time. So,
thank you very much for this great talk. Unfortunately, we only have an hour allocated. We will have to move to the panels, but we have a coffee break afterwards, and we will be very happy if the discussion continues then. Thank you all.